1914. End of the old world. New technology, new tactics, new weapons, new pains. As the war began, there was an excited world. By the end of the war, everything would change. Millions of young people around the world who grew up listening to the war stories their grandfathers told. Young people who grew up hearing about the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, Sudan, the American Civil War. Millions of young people influenced by the stories of their ancestors. They were very excited. It was their turn. They would join the army, honor their countries, and write their own hero stories. But there was something they didn't know. Something they would learn bitterly. This war would be nothing like the stories told. Weapons, bullets, uniforms, everything was changing. Millions who went to the front with their heads held high and with pride would return in a completely different state. If they could return at all. The war the whole world had been waiting for would begin on a hot summer day in 1914. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, visiting Sarajevo, was shot by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip. The assassination caused a shock effect on the global agenda. The bullet hit not only Ferdinand but also peace, and it would ignite millions of bullets. Austria, following the incident, received a guarantee of support from Germany in case of war. Then it gave Serbia an ultimatum that was impossible to accept. On July 28th, before Serbia even responded to the ultimatum, Austria began bombing, igniting the fuse. Germany announced that it would consider a possible Russian mobilization as a cause for war. And Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st and on France on August 3rd. Germany, seeking a clean passage through Belgium to march on France, received a rejection, entered Belgian territory, and Britain considered this a declaration of war. Without exception, all states believed the war would end shortly and that an absolute victory was not far. No one knew the effects of the monsters that had been created. So how did this new generation hell begin? The Germans would act according to the plan known as the Schlieffen Plan in World War I. Named after former Chief of the General Staff Alfred von Schlieffen, who retired in 1906. The massive Russian army in the east would only be able to complete its mobilization in 6 weeks. During this 6-week period, German armies would appear to be responding with full force to France's attack on Alsace-Lorraine. But in reality, the majority of the army would encircle the French army attacking Alsace-Lorraine, bypassing through Belgium and the Netherlands, and would inflict a shameful defeat. France would fall in 40 days, and thus the real war, the Eastern Front, would begin. In the early days of the war, while the Germans defeated the Russians at Tannenberg, they also advanced toward French territory in the west. However, the plan built upon knocking France out would fall apart in early September. As the German armies advanced toward Paris, they made a major mistake near the Marne. The right flank units of the army were far ahead of the other units, and this situation was noticed by the retreating French. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre launched a major attack on the German units left exposed near the Marne. There was no clear winner in the Battle of the Marne. While the Germans retreated to the Eisenline line, French and British forces cautiously followed them. The Germans would settle into positions along the Eisenline line and stop the retreat. But the real story would begin here. The famous Western Front was now beginning to take shape in broad outlines. With the collapse of Germany's quick victory plans, the war was turning into a trench war. But the combatants would come to understand in a very painful way that the war had reached a stalemate. In the struggle known in history as the First Battle of Ypres, tens of thousands of soldiers would fall victim to machine guns, massive artillery, and barbed wire. Every country had weapons of revolutionary importance. Perhaps the greatest of these revolutions was the machine gun. The Germans had the machine Gewehr 08. The Russians had the Puljemyo Maxima weapon. The French had the Hotchkiss, and the British had the Vickers and Lewis. Most of these terrifying tools were developed by following in the path of the first machine gun invented by American inventor Hiram Maxim in 1883, and they would leave a mark on the war. Especially in German war doctrines, the importance of the machine gun was great. German generals, who advocated the proliferation of machines instead of human elements, used large numbers of machine guns to pull back infantry armed with standard rifles into the rear ranks. This increased the production of machine guns. On the battlefield, a unit with a machine gun, if it could gain a good line of sight, could stop a 1,000-man unit. Realizing this, the German army began to build concrete machine gun positions. Thus, a few soldiers with machine guns could inflict bloodshed on a unit of hundreds. This situation slowed down the pace of the war significantly compared to before. Especially while the effectiveness of machine guns was not yet fully understood, thousands of soldiers would fall victim to this weapon. The fact that both sides had large numbers of machine guns would render the armies fixed in place. As machine guns shrank day by day, destroying them also became increasingly difficult. The Titan trench warfare had changed the whole game. In order to protect themselves from this fire, soldiers would have to wear dozens of kilograms of armor. But this was not possible either. Soldiers were helpless in the face of this monster. Moreover, machine guns were not the only problem of the war. Cannons, which had been an indispensable part of battlefields for hundreds of years, had now reached an incredible level. As a gift of the Industrial Revolution, cannons had grown to gigantic proportions. These cannons, if fired accurately enough, could take the lives of hundreds. Companies that were profiting greatly from the war were building larger cannons day by day, governments were placing new orders, and the front was becoming bloodier by the day. But there was a problem with developing cannons. As they grew larger and more advanced, they also became heavier, making them impossible to transport and move. This rendered the cannons unqualified for effective and long-range operations. Artillery units advancing alongside infantry, as in ancient times, were now gone. For infantry unable to advance without artillery support, this meant a limitation in movement. As artillery grew stronger, neither those who possessed it could conduct operations, nor could those opposing it make a move. The defense of fortified positions was also increasing. Both sides were burying themselves in their trenches under the protection of artillery. Now, before launching an offensive, the artillery positions of the opposing side had started to become the first elements to be evaluated. Areas with fewer artillery positions were seen as weak points, and attacks were attempted from those spots. These battles would turn the battlefield into a place of immense brutality. The trench wars, as if all these horrific developments were not enough, would meet a new killer: poison gas. At the beginning of the war, the French and Germans had attempted gas unsuccessfully, and for various reasons, no results had been achieved. One of the Germans' first attempts was carried out near the Wollin region in Poland on the Eastern Front. They threw bombs containing poisonous gas at the Russian lines, but due to the cold weather, the gas froze and did not create the expected effect. As the rapid German advance came to a standstill and the conflict settled into the stalemate of trench warfare, Fritz Haber, later known as the pioneer of chemical warfare, revisited the idea of using poison gas to break the deadlock. Following an earlier unsuccessful attempt, he began working on a more effective deployment method. He turned to chlorine gas, a substance both lethal and fast-acting, which could be sourced in large quantities from paint manufacturing plants. The first large-scale use took place in April 1915 during the Second Battle of Ypres. With the wind in their favor, German forces released around 160 tons of chlorine gas from 6,000 pressurized canisters, directing it from their own lines toward French positions. The gas, carried by the wind, reached the enemy lines and caught 5,000 Allied soldiers completely off guard. The soldiers who saw the approaching cloud suffered horrific agony from the gas they inhaled before they could even understand what was happening. Colonel Henry Mordack, who witnessed those moments, described the soldiers. They were exhausted. Their coats were wide open. They were running like mad, screaming for water, coughing up blood. Some were even rolling on the ground, desperately struggling to breathe. The gases used would diversify and begin to show not only physical, but also psychological effects on soldiers. Poison gases would also claim the lives of tens of thousands in the trenches. As days followed days and months followed months, no solution could be found to trench warfare. Why couldn't the trenches be overcome? The trenches had a highly developed system. They didn't consist of a single line, but of three. The first line was the combat line. The second was the line where soldiers rested and were protected from artillery. The third was the line where the command staff, infirmary, kitchen, and other rear services were located. All of these trenches were protected with machine guns. Poisonous gases and large artillery pieces were not the only killers to appear in World War I. Another was barbed wire. Barbed wire became a complete nightmare once the Western Front turned into trench warfare. The unfortunate soldiers, who received the order to attack from their commanders, would perform a death run toward enemy trenches. If they didn't die from artillery shells, hand grenades, bullets coming from the trenches, or the hail of machine gun fire, they would reach the barbed wire, and to cross it, they had to move very slowly. If they managed to reach the wire by luck, they would be met with machine guns and mines placed between the wires. All of these developments were pushing the war into an ever-deepening stalemate. There was only one way to overcome barbed wire and machine guns: by destroying the position through hours or days of bombardment. But then, the enemy would be informed of the direction from which the assault would come. Protected trenches were being built specifically for machine guns as a precaution. In fact, the solution to the machine gun was armor, but equipping soldiers with armor of such size and weight was impossible. The armor had to be carried by something else, not the soldiers. The production of armored vehicles had begun in those days. However, the area between trenches, known as no man's land, was covered in giant craters caused by explosions. On such terrain, it would be a miracle for even a regular vehicle to advance 100 meters. Normal wheeled vehicles couldn't travel this land. Something else had to be found, something that could withstand the rain of bullets coming from the trenches. If a soldier were to reach the enemy trenches, he would need strong armor. But simply reaching the trenches wasn't enough. There had to be something capable of destroying both the trenches and the enemies within. All of these ideas were about to come together in a single mind, and more importantly, be implemented. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Dunlop Swinton. He had served as an observer officer in the Boer War and the Russo-Japanese War. He had been able to closely observe changing battlefields and weapon technologies. In his diary, he would describe the state of the war. The first problem he encountered at the front was that both sides had heavy artillery to protect themselves and had time to strengthen their positions. Also, the fact that massive forces were compressed into a small region of France was another problem. On October 19, 1914, an idea came to Swinton's mind to solve the deadlock that had persisted for months. Inspired by the track tractor produced by American inventor Benjamin Holt, Swinton realized that a vehicle was needed, one that had powerful drive capabilities, armor that would not be affected by bullets, could destroy machine guns, cross rough terrain and trenches, overcome barbed wire, and be unaffected by piles of debris. Churchill was the first high-ranking military bureaucrat to recognize the potential of tanks and support them. In a letter he wrote to Prime Minister Herbert Asquith on January 5, 1915, he stated how modern warfare had reached a stalemate and that it was nearly impossible to effectively break through enemy defenses. Churchill proposed an experimental vehicle to the Prime Minister. He explained that track tractors carrying machine guns and covered with armor would not be affected by enemy machine guns and would be able to easily tear through trenches and barbed wire. Design work continued with the Landships Committee and naval engineers. The first prototype appeared toward the end of 1915. Little Willie was the first fruit of the project. It was a rather small and agile vehicle. However, it was not yet suitable for use in war. The features desired by Swinton and the Army had not yet been achieved. A series of reinforcements and improvements were made on the Little Willie prototype. The newly created vehicle would be even better. The new prototype, called Big Willie, or Mother, would form the essence of the first real battle tank. Big Willie was built in a walled-off factory in Lincoln, England, by Chinese workers and technicians who were not allowed to see their families. 2 machine guns were mounted, positioned in reverse to face behind and to the sides of each cannon. A third was placed in the center of the driver's compartment, facing forward. The crew consisted of 1 officer and 9 personnel, 10 people in total. Its weight was exactly 22 tons. Its speed could reach up to 5.6 kilometers per hour. The 105 horsepower Daimler tractor engine allowed it to reach a maximum speed of 10 kilometers per hour on flat terrain. It had a 6-unit gearbox, 4 forward and 2 reverse gears. Big Willie was divided into 2 categories, male and female. These names were part of maintaining secrecy. The main weapon of the male Willie was the cannon. The females only carried machine guns. Swinton stated that he was inspired by nature in making this classification. According to him, the male Willie would have a sword and a design that protected the female. It would be the one to advance on the front lines during operations. By the end of 1915, all tests had been completed. The tanks could protect their crew, carry weapons, destroy machine guns, break through barbed wire, and cross enemy trenches. It had the capacity to carry 2 6-pounder guns and approximately 300 shells. It could be transported by rail and be ready to move at any moment. Everyone was very impressed and stunned by this performance. I'm attaching its photograph. Its appearance resembles a great antediluvian monster. It can easily cross swamps. The concealment of this newly developed vehicle was also one of the most important matters. If it were to be discovered through espionage, the enemy could act quickly and steal the design. A coded name had to be found, and thus the famous name Tank was born. Most of the workers involved in its construction believed they were manufacturing water-carrying vehicles for the armies fighting in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The British were working intensely to maintain secrecy. This is precisely why tanks carrying cannons were called male, and those carrying machine guns were called female. The Germans, engaged in espionage, had no idea what to make of phrases like, "Today, 12 males will arrive for you. 6 females will follow shortly." To give the impression that the tanks were snow-clearing vehicles during delivery, the phrase "Attention to Petrograd" was written in Cyrillic on them. This, too, was to disrupt potential espionage activities. At the beginning of 1916, the British accelerated the production of their new toys. To address problems related to tanks, a tank supply committee was formed. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Stern was placed in charge of the department. Eustace de Ayncourt, the architect of many ships belonging to the Royal Navy, was also on the committee. Swinton was appointed as the commander of the tank units in March. Initially, the organization consisted of 15 companies. Each company had 2 sections of 6 tanks each, and a full company consisted of 15 officers and 106 soldiers. Training began secretly and without tanks at the training camp in Beasley, located 25 kilometers southwest of London. The first units were selected from the Navy's artillery school and the machine gun corps. Tank engines were ordered from America. At the first stage, the Army ordered 150 males and 100 females. The tanks produced were tested with German machine guns. The tank committee wanted the tanks to be painted cream, but this would prove to be a futile request because once the tanks entered the trenches, into no man's land, they would handle their own camouflage with mud and earth. Despite many issues encountered on the production line, Britain was doing its utmost to get these new monsters to the army fighting on the front lines. From the Marne onward, the Western Front kept getting worse day by day. Since 1915, the trenches had expanded significantly, and the commanders who still believed that the war could be won through offensive action had not yet understood the realities of this new kind of war. This war, by its very nature, favored the defending side. Command staffs that refused to face this reality for a long time wanted to win through final offensives, but every clash resulted in tens of thousands of casualties. The Western Front was never satisfied with blood. 1916 would be the year of the apocalypse. After the Battle of the Marne forced the war into a deadlock, Helmuth von Moltke was removed from the position of Chief of General Staff. He was replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn, a figure who would also be important in Turkish history. Falkenhayn was increasingly realizing that the possibility of victory was fading. As long as he fought three major armies at once, things would continue to worsen. He wanted to eliminate the French by launching a battle of attrition that would force them out of the war. He chose another historically significant location for the assault, the city of Verdun. Verdun had historical importance for the French. Therefore, the French army would have to defend it at all costs. The goal was not to capture Verdun, but to inflict on France such irreparable casualties that they would be unable to recover. Falkenhayn, in his own words, wanted to bleed the French dry. But the result did not go as he expected. The longest battle of the World War was fought at Verdun. From February to December 1916, for 10 full months, both sides together created another hell. During the battle, approximately 40 million artillery shells would be fired. The total death toll on both sides would reach 300,000, with 750,000 total casualties. In the battle to take just one hill called Dead Man's Hill, the French would lose 89,000 men and the Germans 82,000. Once again, there would be no winner in this war of steel and bone. While the horrors of Verdun continued, the French wanted their British allies to launch an assault to relieve German pressure. The two countries, which had been planning a joint offensive since late 1915, had suspended the plan due to Germany's Verdun attack. An assault that would begin south of Verdun would force the Germans to divide their forces. French calls for this effort would be answered in the summer of 1916. The British planned an offensive of a scale never before seen in their history. The assault, planned by Douglas Haig, would be executed by the Fourth Army under General Rawlinson's command. But the Somme did not begin as the British had expected. In a week-long preparatory bombardment that began on June 24th, the British rained 1.5 million shells on German trenches. Believing that nothing could have survived the hellfire they unleashed, the British left their trenches with confidence. They formed ranks and calmly walked through no man's land for a while. But the Germans, who had been on alert due to the week-long bombardment, once again set up their machine guns against the approaching British. By the end of the first day of the Somme, 19,000 British soldiers were dead and 57,000 had been wounded. Like the other battles, the Somme was becoming a grave for thousands of soldiers day by day. Losing the moral upper hand, the British advanced the timeline of the project they had been working on in extraordinary secrecy for months. As it would be the first of its kind, they were also very curious about how it would turn out. Preparations were not yet fully completed, tactical plans and training were not yet finished, but General Haig could no longer wait. Autumn rains were coming. It would also be a morale booster for the demoralized units. So, what was coming? Male, female, Willie, mother. Whatever it was called, history would record it under one name: tank. On September 15th, 1916, it was finally on stage to make its debut.